let's talk a little bit about cybersecurity. So first question, as you know, Wild Ventures solely invest in cybersecurity. You invest most of the time in cybersecurity. So the obvious question, are we in a bubble? What's going on?
Are we in a bubble? So look, I think if you take a step back and you think about what are big markets, cybersecurity and security is an ever-changing, growing market. You can look at it and say there's $120 billion of spend that will probably happen in cybersecurity across software, hardware, and services. And so ultimately, when you think about it, there are periods of time, and you have these, what I call boom cycles, where there's a lot of new ideas, a lot of innovation, and then the market has to catch up with those ideas. And so I would say it's a cycle. And through 14 and 15, there was a tremendous amount of funding in cybersecurity. We saw, I think it was $3.8 billion in 2015. 2016, we saw a similar amount of money. And so what you're seeing right now is a bit of the entrepreneurs, the companies, catching up with the ideas, meaning they're implementing what they've done. And so I would say right now we're seeing a little bit of a lower amount of investment as really the market and the ideas start to mature. We did see a period of time, though, which was one of the challenges that we faced, was that many of the companies, you didn't have one or two, you had 4 or 5 companies doing similar things. And that was a bit of a problem because markets can't support 5 companies. And so ultimately the idea is, we are seeing a bit of a pause in new investments, but I still think it's a vibrant market. The end market is very big, and I'm still bullish long-term on security.
All right, so you mentioned, how cybersecurity became a very competitive, overly crowded space. In every sector, you see perhaps too many vendors. As two investors now talking, what are some of the greenfield opportunities that you identify in cybersecurity? Is there such a thing as a blue ocean sector within cybersecurity? That's basically what we're always looking for.
I think what you try to look for is what are the big waves that are happening in the marketplace. So if you think about it, we are in a 20-year transition from on-premise to the cloud. And why do I say that? You look at the biggest companies today that are doing cloud infrastructure, companies like AWS, it's a $30 billion business. But if you look at what gets spent in the data center on an annual basis, we're still spending $500 billion. $500 billion is spent in the data center today, every year. So we're still in the very early innings of this migration. And so the question for all of us is, what is security going to look like as we migrate from on-prem to the cloud? And I think we've just scratched the surface. A lot of folks are dealing with configurations. How do I make sure that my configurations of my cloud infrastructure is correct? I would say that is the very basic beginning of what has to happen. And so I still think that there's a lot of changes that are coming as companies really start adopting true cloud-first initiatives inside of their companies. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. The second thing I spend a lot of time talking about is this idea of frictionless security. What do I mean by that? We used to build security products that would be added onto or connected to the infrastructure. Every API, every security product now needs to think about, how do I make it easy for developers to integrate my capabilities into what they're doing, or easily integrate with the infrastructure. And so kind of an API-first security solution is what we're expecting to be an important evolution of security.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mentioned cloud, and this is a very big topic, for us, in our investment strategy. Can you be more specific about what are the new security challenges of corporates as they migrate to the cloud? In different stages of their migration, there are different challenges.
Yeah, I think when you look at what's happening in cloud migration, we see the adoption of new technologies like Kubernetes, and what's going to happen as you move to a containerized world, and what are the solutions you're going to need. And I think, again, we're still very early in what these solutions are doing, and I don't think we've done a good enough job of thinking through, how do I operationalize these cloud applications, and what does it mean to secure them?
What are the challenges around data security in cloud?
Well, the interesting thing about data security in the cloud, and this is when I was saying this idea of frictionless security, our SaaS applications, every one of them, whether it's Slack, whether it's S3 buckets, whether it's GitHub, all of these technologies are valuable data is being stored in them. And if you think about what control you have or what control businesses have over that technology, it's fairly limited, right? I can, if you take a company that's heavily using Slack, you don't have a lot of controls over what people are putting into those applications. And so from my vantage point, I would tell you that the data will move into the apps, and the controls inside the apps are still too primitive, because we've done a lot of things that are rules-based. We've done a lot of things that require human intervention, and we have to do a much better job of automating the detection and management of that data in the applications.
So as large enterprises migrate to cloud, many of them adopt either multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment. It's not like they're moving to everything to one cloud. So if I'm an entrepreneur who's doing a cloud security company, what's the right way for me to think about multi-cloud strategy, specifically when I think about my go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, I think the way you have to think about what are customers doing. Customers don't want to be locked into a platform, right? Every customer I talk to says, I've lived through the world where Oracle and SAP used to be able to charge me whatever they wanted, right? Once I got onto Oracle financials, and nothing against Oracle, I'm not throwing stones here, but customers didn't like the idea that you couldn't migrate off the platform, right? Once you started using it, you were almost stuck. And so customers are saying the same thing as they think about cloud technologies. And what you hear them talk about is really this idea that they want to be able to pick what cloud infrastructure they use. They want to be able to not be locked in. And what does that mean? From a security perspective for us, it means that they want consistent ways of implementing policies across clouds. They want a simple way that says, if I need to say users have access to something, I don't need to have a different system for Azure and Google and Amazon. And so I think the key to this is really think about designing what you're building in a way that your customer will not have to learn a new system if they move to a different cloud. And every CISO that I talk to really understands this problem, and they are playing catch up because they don't have mature enough tools that work across the different cloud vendors. They have maybe something that works well on AWS, which is a good starting point, but they really are hungry to see solutions that can work across the other cloud vendors.
All right, let's talk about another topic that we find interesting, which is security operations. So we all hear from CISOs that the SOC, the security operations centers, are struggling to keep up, with the amounts of alerts and tasks that they should perform. What types of innovation and technologies do you think are missing there, and what can we do in order to optimize the performance of security operations centers?
Yeah, I think if you take a step back, this has been the age-old problem that there is not enough security talent available for the amount of security work that needs to be done. And it's actually simple math. If you look at the United States, and I don't have stats for all over the world, but in the US, we're only graduating about 100,000 people a year in what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so if you think about that, 100,000 people total, how many of those people want to be security professionals? 3%? 2%? 2,000 people, 3,000 people is no way it's enough. There's no way that can meet the needs of all of the different companies that need security expertise. So you start with that problem. So then what you have to think about, and again, I've looked at how do we prioritize events, alerts, and other things. And I think we're still not great at it. I think that we have to really figure out what is it that really matters. And we're still trying to look at lots of data and trying to figure out how do I sort through that data to find something that's meaningful and interesting. What we're seeing is we get better, meaning we went from the SIM platform to a data lake, but then the question is, are we effectively taking the data from the data lake into the security operations center where it's not taking 50 to 60 minutes per event that a SOC analyst has to triage. And so from my vantage point, what has to happen is we have to get a lot better at what is it that really matters in the security operations center. And we've seen a lot of work in trying to automate the steps. I think that's interesting, but it's really not changed the game dramatically. It really has said, I go through these steps as a SOC analyst, I can make it a little better. And so I'm not trying to take shots at the SOAR vendors. I think they're a step forward, but I actually don't believe they've meaningfully changed the problem. And so what really needs to happen is how do we have better data models that help us understand what is it that matters and optimize or make it possible so that the security analyst doesn't have to spend lots of time doing the same repetitive, mundane task. And I think whoever figures that out is going to build a very big company.
So obviously the the buzzwords in this industry are machine learning and AI, specifically for automation. Do you think that there is actual room for these technologies in optimizing and automating perhaps some of the security operations center operations?
Yeah, when you think about AI and machine learning, I think the reality is we are going to be able to use AI in a way that allows us to build models that help us understand what to focus on. But here's the age-old problem in security. There was a book written in the 50s called What Computers Can't Do. And it was updated in the 90s, and it's called What Computers Still Can't Do. One of the things that computers are notoriously bad at is context, right? So I can look at a message in my inbox, and I can immediately say, this came from Ofer, because it's referencing tonight's Fireside chat, and I'm going to go ahead and know that's a legitimate message. Instantaneously. I mean, like all of us. I can look at another message and say, that's obviously something, somebody wants to sell me something. A computer, to make that distinction, is actually very, very difficult. And so the question for us as we think about using ML is, how do we provide enough context so that when we try to figure out what matters and what doesn't, we're actually able to really sort through it. And from my vantage point, you got to solve this context problem. How do you have context for a specific business? And I think it's going to get down to, what does it mean for a retailer? What does it mean for the specific retailer? What does it mean for a bank? What does it mean in financial services? What it means for a specific bank? So we're going to have a lot of context as we work with ML to really be effective at using it to optimize or improve the SOC.
Let's talk a little bit about you and your background, Enrique.
Sure.
So you were the CEO of Symantec for 10 years.
That's right. I was there 19 in total.
Yeah, and then you moved to the venture capital world.
That's right.
We'd like to hear more about that transition and what did you learn from that transition, and perhaps what surprised you when you moved from that position to an early stage investor?
How much easier it is to be an investor than an entrepreneur? No.
Agreed.
No, I think what I learned, look, it's very, very different when you're running a business, and I don't know if we'll talk about it, but I've done a number of startups, and when you're running a startup, or when you're running Symantec had 21,000 employees, 7 billion in revenue, you really are a generalist. You're looking at lots of different things inside the company. What I loved about coming to the venture business, which was fantastic, is I actually got to focus and spend time thinking about what mattered. What I mean by that is, let's say I had a thesis that IoT was interesting. I could go spend time with our team thinking about what are all the interesting companies, what are the interesting problems. When you run a big company, you're just, your schedule runs your life, and you're going from one thing to the next. And I actually found it amazing to be able to spend time thinking about what matters, what's interesting, what are entrepreneurs doing, instead of just task to task running around. And I don't miss, as a public company CEO, having to make quarterly numbers.
That's great. And as a former entrepreneur yourself, can you share a little bit about your views about the relationship between entrepreneurs and their investors? What are the pitfalls, and what are the right ways to build a meaningful relationship?
Well, maybe a little context. So I did my first startup right out of college. I went to work for a big bank, and I realized very quickly that I didn't want to work at a big bank. And my 6 of us, we started a company. So I've been doing this for a long time. So my startup worked diagramming IBM network terminals. So figuring out where all the terminals were and how to manage them and how to script them. And because there was something called an NCP gen, which controlled the IBM network inside of your connected to your mainframe. And so what we did is we started this company because if you were trying to add a new user into the network and you made a mistake as you were entering that user, it would potentially knock a lot of people off the network. I mean, so imagine, new user starts, they try to edit it, they make a mistake, 100 people are knocked off the network. So we figured out how to visually fix that problem. So I was working at home, back in my old bedroom, and I would sit at programming day and night, and we figured out how to do this. And what was really cool about this experience was that we had product market fit. Everybody we showed the product to said, I have that problem, and you can solve it, which was awesome, right? That was ideal. And what ended up happening was this company approached us and said, we'd like to buy your startup. And I was working at home, sounded interesting. I went to meet with them. They offered us $8 million. This is 1988. And I thought, holy smokes, I'm 23, about to be 24. That's an incredible sum of money. I went and I told my father. My father was a mechanic, an airplane mechanic. And I said, Dad, they just offered us $8 million to buy this company. And my dad looked at me and he goes, you're kidding, right? And I said, no, I'm not kidding. And then he said, is it legal? I said, yeah, it's legal. And so we ended up selling the company. Now, the reason I tell you that story is because I hadn't raised any venture money. It was me and 5 other friends who were working tirelessly on our vision, our passion, and I didn't have any advisors. I didn't have people who I could turn to and say, do we have something special here? Are we making progress? Because I was young, I hadn't built a company ever, and so that first startup was interesting, and I learned a tremendous amount because maybe it was right to sell it, but it could have also been right to build it, and that was probably one of the early meaningful lessons that I learned, because in hindsight, I don't know. Now, if I roll the clock forward, and I went to another startup. I was working for Peter Norton. I'll skip that, but I'll go to the startup I sold to Symantec, where I was CEO. There, I had a group of investors, great investors. Many of them, they had helped me through the first few rounds. And what was very different was I spent time really trying to figure out who could help me, who was really helpful, had time, cared about the startup. It was important to them. And I didn't treat every investor the same. I spent time with the folks who I thought were really going to help me and my team build the business. And I think it's important. All investors are not created equal. Some of them have more expertise in a particular area. Some of them have areas where they can be more helpful. And so I found that while I tried to work closely and have a good relationship with all of them, I did try to prioritize who I felt could really help me on the journey, who was really, committed to my success and was not just, they'd written a Series A check or a Series B check, but was really in it to help me and the employees build the company. So I think you have to figure out who's really in your corner.
What's your definition of a value-add investor?
I was fortunate in my startup because the chairman of the company was somebody who I learned a lot from. He was a fabulous listener. He was somebody who I could talk to about what were the problems I had week to week, and he didn't try to tell me what to do. He tried to help me think through the answers. And I think when I look at the the kind of investor that I want to be. Again, all the entrepreneurs have more context, they have more information, more understanding of their business. So I think a great investor is somebody who is a great listener and tries to help you as the entrepreneur get to the right point, not to tell you what to do. I think the second thing is a great investor is somebody who understands what the company needs. What do you need from building a go-to-market model? What do you need from engaging with customers? What are the interesting problems that you may not be anticipating as you're trying to build your business that I've seen either from my own direct experience as an operator or that maybe I've seen in another company? The other thing I would tell you as an investor, and I sit on the board of companies like Atlassian and DocuSign, it really is dangerous when an investor overly pattern matches. When they think, well, it worked at this company, so then it's got to work at this company. That is really a very difficult situation. And you've probably seen it, many of you who have run your own companies, where the investor walks in and says, hey, company X did this. Maybe you should do that too. Reality is, maybe, right? Maybe not. And so I think a great investor is somebody who's not trying to tell you what to do, overly pattern match, but is really understanding what you need, what your company's trying to do, and has really taken the time to understand your business, has really taken the time to be prepared when they show up to a board meeting. I know I was annoyed many times when it felt like it was just my board meeting was just another meeting for them, instead of this meeting being something that was important. And so that's what I'm looking for in an investor, somebody who's genuinely invested, personally invested, not financially invested, in the success of my company.
Yeah. Great word. Let's talk a little bit about Israel. You visit here quite often. When you compare the typical Israeli entrepreneur to their peers in the US, do you see any differences, pros and cons? And as an investor, do you have different relationships with Israeli entrepreneurs compared to others?
I would say the profile of an entrepreneur anywhere in the world is going to be more similar than not. And why do I say that? Right, it takes a special individual to be an entrepreneur. It takes a special individual to, throw caution to the wind, to take risks, to take chances, to leave potentially a great job at a bigger company and say, I want to do something different. I want to change the world. And so entrepreneurs around the world, in my opinion, they're ambitious, they're risk takers, they have a passion that you can't teach or coach, right? That they are basically have a drive that makes them say, I'm going to do something special. And so what I would tell you is there's more things that are common than not. Now, what I would say about the Israel in particular is that the density, the amount, the number of entrepreneurs here is, to me, incredible. I mean, I come here for a week. My colleague Stefan and I, from Monday to Friday, I want to say we'll have one-on-one meetings with probably 50, 60 companies. I mean, it's incredible to me, the number, the volume, the amount of innovation, the amount of talent. I was sending a message to somebody I work with in the US, and I said, it is incredible here. And, you have a great network. And what I would say is, some of you may be competitive with each other on what your businesses are doing. Question is, how do you all share information? Because the amount of talent in this area is fantastic. And how do you share about best practices? How do you build your startup? What is the best way to interact with investors? We should figure out ways to do that, because I think here in the Israeli market, there's just so much talent.
Yeah, and I agree, and I actually see it more and more. It is a small community, and in cyber there are so many Israeli cybersecurity companies, and some of them do compete with each other. But at the end of the day, we're Israelis, and we share the knowledge, and we share the experience, and that's a very big advantage for the Israeli community. And we've been in the business of investing in Israeli companies for many years, and we see that the level of maturity of Israeli entrepreneurs is just growing. The level of experience and business savviness of technological entrepreneurs coming out of Israel just increases over time, and that's mainly due to the tight ecosystem that's being formed here. Yeah. Let's talk a little about go-to-market. I would say that in general, Israeli entrepreneurs are known for their technological skills, but we're in Israel, we're not based in the US. What advice would you give to Israeli entrepreneurs when they think about go-to-market in the US?
Well, I think the thing that's important when you think about go-to-market is, and I sometimes draw a picture, and some of you may have seen it, but the way I describe it is before you think about all the details of the go-to-market, you have to start with almost a framework of how you will approach any market. And what do I mean by that? If you think about it, you can use a direct selling model. You can use an indirect selling model. I mentioned the board of Atlassian. They use a model that I call a trial model, right? You basically get to use the product, Jira, for example. You use 5 licenses, and you don't pay until you get to the 6th license. We call that a trial model. You have people who have freemiums, right? You give something away, and then you upsell. You have folks who have a network effect. That's another model. So imagine that those are different ways you can go to market. Then you think about what is the selling motion itself? Is it a self-service model where I basically go to the website and buy it? Is it a short cycle sales model where it takes me less than 90 days, or is it a long cycle? I mean, does it take me potentially 180 days to a year? And so when you think about it, before you talk about, let's say, the U.S. market, it's how are you thinking about the decision you make of how you will create your selling motion. And so to me, it's very important because what I'm looking for oftentimes is who has thought through what does it mean to build your sales organization. Let me give you an example. I don't have a problem if somebody says, I need a direct salesperson and I'm going to go after the largest 2,000 companies in the world. And I believe that the ASP, the average selling price, is going to be $250,000 per contract. I can make that math work, right? If I hire one salesperson, they have a quota of $1.2 million in ARR, and they do 4 or 5 deals, you can make the math work. The problem comes in where you say, I want to have a direct sales force. Your ASP, it takes you 6 months to do a deal, and you get $70,000 out of that deal, and you're not going to get much more, right? So to me, kind of fundamentals of thinking through, am I going to be able to use a trial model and generate a lead where somebody's successful with my product, and then I convert them with an inside salesperson. And so maybe I only get 70K, but I get 70K for a person who is not having to go visit the customer, who's more efficient, where I can give them a quota of 500K or 600K. And I can do those deals in 30, 60, 90 days. And so before we talk about the specifics of how you go to market in the US, you have to solve this problem. You have to understand, do you have a direct sales model? Is it short cycle? Are you doing self-service? How have you engineered your product to deliver into the different selling motion that you've created? When you think about the US, now turning our attention there, I think what really matters in many cases is getting a small number of very referenceable customers. Very referenceable customers. And I think the founder being involved in those initial sales, really understanding how customers are going to consume your technology and being able to get the customer to be that highly qualified reference matters tremendously. And I don't buy for a minute when people tell me customers don't want to be references. That's not true. Customers, you make them successful, they'll be a reference. They may not be a public reference. They may not be able to use their name because their corporation may have a limitation of saying, I can't, use the General Motors brand or the JP Morgan brand or the, you pick it, Cisco brand, any brand publicly. But if you make them successful, they will be willing to tell other people that they're using your product. And so I think when you go into a market like the US, you have to get those 5 referenceable customers. And don't kid yourself. If you can't do it, you have to ask yourself, why am I not being able to do that? And once you've got that, now you can start thinking about, how do I really start ramping the machine? How do I start thinking, do I go inside sales, do I go outside sales, as we discussed before? And how do I make sure that I can leverage that base that I created to expand? There's a couple other tactics that I've used. I talk about 5 referenceable customers. Sometimes I talk about verticals. So if your product lends itself to verticals, you have to have a similar approach where you may say, I want a few referenceable customers in a vertical, because people like to do business with companies that are basically that you're already doing business with some of the people they look at as their peers.
So for an early stage company, your advice would be to target specific verticals, or to go broad and nail several customers in different verticals?
I think it depends on what you're building. You know, from my vantage point, I would prefer to think about horizontally. But for some solutions, you may want to start in financial services, or you may want to start in healthcare, or you may want to start in telecom. And so it just depends on what you're building. But I like the idea of going horizontal, getting the 5 referenceable customers in a horizontal way.
All right. You know, we talked earlier about how cybersecurity is such a competitive market. And my question to you is, how do you create a sustainable competitive advantage as an early stage company that you could be late to market, you could be competing against more well-funded companies that can spend a lot of marketing and so on. So what's the best way to differentiate, and what's the role of intellectual property in that competition?
Yeah, I'll take the second part of the question first. So what's the role of IP and patent protection? I would say you really can't depend on patent. You can't, and I know Ashok was here earlier, so he might disagree with me on this. But
Ashok is our attorney.
Yeah, exactly. so I think that getting patents does matter. You do want to have patents in your portfolio. I don't think you could depend on them to protect you. I don't think you can really build a company saying my patents will protect me. Again, you don't want people infringing on your IP, but that's not how you're going to win in the market.
Or maybe you could say, we're doing something that our competitors don't do because our technology is better.
Sure, absolutely. Now let's talk about the first part of your question, which is differentiation. This is one of the most important things that you got to, from day one in your business, you have to really find out, what is it that I am doing that is differentiated, especially in cybersecurity, in infrastructure. Just the idea that you've conceptualized, what am I doing that others can't immediately copy, right? And I would tell you that as you work with folks like us, this is an important topic for us, because we don't want to see 5 people doing exactly what you've already done. And so the technique that I've always found the most useful as you're doing this is, you have to be out there trying to not think about what is the customer has to have today. What are they going to be needing 12 months from now? What are they going to need 36 months from now? And I think that's how you start thinking about trying to create sustainable competitive advantage. Your initial founding idea will hopefully have some differentiation, but the second part of it is think ahead, think out some amount of time. What is the problem that the customer is going to need solving? And I see this in startups a lot, because you end up saying, I got to get my initial idea to work. I got to get that set of functionality to be usable by my customer. And you're very focused on the near term. So I think you have to raise up a little bit, and you have to think about a little longer term. And if you do that and you stay close to your customers, I think you will be able to create that advantage that's more enduring.
So that's maybe a follow-up question on that. How do you build a very big cybersecurity company? As we all know, the cybersecurity market is very acquisitive. Only yesterday, portfolio company of yours, Observe IT, an Israeli company, got acquired by Proofpoint for $225 million, right? That's what the paper said. What are the components in a startup that enable it to grow even beyond that, to become, the next billion-dollar company in cybersecurity?
Yeah. So I think that the first place you got to start with, and we were having a discussion earlier, about the idea of this: is it a feature, is it a product, or is it a platform? Right. And so, if you're going to build a sustainable company, you really have to think about what's the breadth of what you're doing. And look, I'll use a company that, I was in the endpoint antivirus business, and that was what Symantec did. I worked on Norton Antivirus 1991. It's a long time ago. And now you have a company, CrowdStrike. But CrowdStrike came in as an EDR vendor. You have other companies who are trying to be EDR vendors. But what they're doing right is they used the endpoint as a starting point for a much broader platform that they're trying to build to deliver intelligence to their customers. And so the way you start a company is you usually start by building some set of functionality that'll look like a feature. But you have to think about how that product is going to expand beyond the initial idea to be something that you can definitely not just have one thing you sold to the customer, but a broader set of capabilities you sold to the customer. The second thing I would tell you that's important is the more horizontal your solution is, meaning the more that it's available not to just thousands of customers, but it's available to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers, that's how you're going to build really big cybersecurity companies. You take, Checkpoint, one of the early, success stories of the Israeli market. Why is Checkpoint such a big company? It's a big company because when we got on the internet, we all needed firewalls. And so that's a very horizontal play. So if you want to build a big business, is it something that tens of thousands of customers will need? It doesn't mean that's the only way, but that's one of the important ways.
All right, so my last question before I hand it over to the audience. Most of the folks here are cybersecurity entrepreneurs or, aspiring entrepreneurs. And I would like to ask you to provide them 3 pieces of advice. One from your experience as an entrepreneur, one as from your experience as the CEO of one of the largest security vendors in the world, and one as a venture capitalist.
You didn't tell me we were going to ask that.
That was a surprise question.
No, actually, we didn't get into a lot of details about the questions. I actually prefer not to know them. This one I definitely have to think about. So first one is as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
What would I say? Being an entrepreneur is hard. You have a lot of doubts about something. You kind of sometimes doubt, will you be successful? And so one of the things that I think helped me in my second startup was I realized that the lows aren't really that low and the highs aren't really that high. What do I mean by that? It's never as bad as you think it is, and sometimes it's probably not as good as you think it is. And so you just got to be balanced. You gotta persevere, and you lose. I remember you lose a talented employee, and you feel like, oh my gosh, I lost that talented person. It's a problem, and then you win a big customer. And so again, you just gotta for the entrepreneurs, perseverance. It's not a straight line to success, and the highs are important, but the lows really aren't usually that bad. Okay.
It's a great advice.
The next one you said is as CEO of. So as CEO of Symantec, we bought in the 19 years we probably bought over 40 companies. I would say the companies are bought, not sold. So if you're thinking about potentially being a part of a bigger company, the best thing is for the company to understand the better together story, meaning why will I make a big difference to them, but it's that they understand that, not that you are telling them, right? So it's really about the bigger company knowing the real value from their perspective and not you saying you should buy us. That's what I would say from being the CEO of a big company. Yeah. And then as an investor?
And then as a VC, yeah.
What advice would you give you as a VC? What advice? So as a VC, what I would say is the following. For you entrepreneurs, I like the idea that bad news should travel faster than good news. See, a lot of times you want to just tell people what the good stuff is. I think that's good. You should tell them. But when something isn't working, when you're having a struggle, you're trying to think through how you're going to make your company successful, talk about that. And don't feel bad about it. And because the more you're being transparent early, I actually think it will pull people in, and you'll all be in the same team. You'll all be, working together to solve the problem. And so I would say, from the venture side, we want to be involved. We want to be involved early. We want to feel like you see us as a trusted partner, not as just a funding source.
Sometimes we can help.
Sometimes.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Enrique.